Hi everyone, welcome back to Environmental Economics. And whereas last time we talked about valuing life and valuing health and regulating risk, today we're going to continue our discussion of risk and harm. And we'll start with kind of an offshoot from the topic of risk and harm with something called offsets. So it's not about risk per se, but it's important, and so when we discuss it, it'll lead into our conceptualization of risk. And to discuss offsets, let's first consider some sort of entity. It can be a firm, a country, a person, and we'll call this entity A. And entity A has a responsibility to reduce its emissions of some pollutant. Now, entity A can either directly reduce its own emissions, think about you as a person polluting less, or entity A can do this side thing, this indirect thing that we'll call an offset. Now, it's important to note that this will only work if the pollutant is uniformly mixed. Which, remember from earlier lectures, means that the damage caused does not depend on the location of the sources. So think about pollutants that don't have hotspots. So entity A can either reduce its pollution on its own, or it can do this indirect thing. And the indirect thing is an offset. An offset is a reduction in emissions relative to some baseline, where the reduction is undertaken by a different entity. We'll call that entity B instead of entity A. What this means is that entity A is paying entity B to do the reduction for it. And the reduction is credited to A, even though B is the one reducing, relative, of course, to some baseline. So in a sense, A is causing the required reduction, but physically, it's happening somewhere else. Let's give an example. Suppose Sweetbriar wants everyone to reduce the amount of trash they use by 5 pounds of trash a year. I can either throw less trash out, or I can pay one of you to reduce the amount of trash you use by 5 pounds, so your total reduction will be 10 pounds. But in the eyes of Sweetbriar, on average, everyone has reduced their trash by 5 pounds. Now, what's good about this system? What are the pros of this system? So in theory, we can fit offsets into any kind of systems if the system designers allow for it. What this means is that polluters can be allowed to buy offsets so that their net emissions are counted as their direct emissions minus whatever they've paid to offset, minus what they have offset. So in this sense, though it fits in many systems, it's most natural in a cap and trade setting. Because in this sort of setting, we're already trading permits, and offsets basically act like additional permits that can be bought and sold on the same market. To that end, the concept of offsets makes most sense in a climate change context. I'm drawing some smoke here because a reduction in emissions can look like a reduction in a source, for instance, emitting from carbon from a plant, but it can also look like an increase in a sink. So building more forest, planting more forest, so there's more places for those pollutants to go. So what's wrong? What are the cons of something like an offset? Well, broadly speaking, we'll think of two cons. We call them additionality and verifiability. But let's think conceptually of what these cons might be before we start to define them, right? The trickiest thing about offsets is the fact that they're measured with respect to the baseline. We saw a similar problem last lecture when we were doing cost-benefit analysis, where there might be fake baselines in place. It's easy for us to envision that if you have to pay for a new acre of planted forest, the relative baseline may have been that it wouldn't have happened. But what if we're already cutting down lots of forest? Then is the baseline the trend? Is the baseline what was going to happen anyway? Is the offset only valid if the new forest was protected? And in that case, we see that in the naturally occurring world, empirically, governments tend to protect forests with the least opportunity cost, the one that they weren't going to cut down anyway. This is what we mean when we say additionality. Did the offset generate net emissions reductions that were additional to what would have happened in the counterfactual, that were additional to what we would have seen regardless? And this is very hard to tell for any given offset because we have to assess what would have happened in that counterfactual. We have to assess what would have happened had the offset not been bought and sold. The other large problem with offsets is this concept of verifiability. This means that in some cases, it's hard to monitor the thing that was promised by the offset generator. So if I'm paying one of you to throw out 5 fewer pounds of trash, and all I see is, the garbage cans at Sweetbriar, how do I know that you did or didn't do the thing that you said you were going to do? This is particularly difficult in the markets where we tend to see offsets. For instance, if you are being paid not to deforest, forests are very large and hard to monitor. If you are being paid to reduce your CO2 emissions, but CO2 isn't uniformly mixed, so there are no hotspots, how do we know that that came from you and not from me? Nevertheless, we know that it's expensive to directly reduce emissions. So if we want to get cost-effective reductions, we have to consider something like offsets. For instance, right now, we can't have air travel that's carbon-free. So if we want to see a net reduction in carbon emissions from air travel, we need to do it with some sort of offsetting variation. What does this have to do with the topic under consideration right now, risk and uncertainty? Well, to answer that, let's first explore what risk means. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We live in an uncertain world. And we have to make decisions not knowing what's going to happen in the future. We make decisions ex ante before the thing. When the future is uncertain, we make decisions not knowing what's going to happen. And we live with the consequences of those decisions ex post, after the thing, after the uncertainty has been resolved. We make decisions before we know what state of the world we live in, whether it's a good or a bad state, whether it is a probable or improbable state. So on your own, press pause on the video for a second and think of an environmental example that involves risk. And this is where offsets typically come into play because most environmental examples that involve risk involve climate change. For instance, my brother lives in New Orleans. We know it's costly to install a seawall. And if we don't install that seawall, there's a chance that nothing bad happens. But if there's a severe storm surge without a seawall, it will cause a lot of damages. And what we as environmental economists need to do is a way to aid our decision making and characterize these risks. So generally, we characterize risks by two different things. First, we need the possible outcomes, which we list as x's with subscripts, x sub 1, x sub 2, and so on through x sub k if there are k possible states of the world. And by states of the world, we just mean outcomes. So in that example I gave a second ago, there's the state of the world where there's no storm surge, there's the state of the world where there's a mild storm surge, all the way up to the state of the world where there's a severe storm surge. Now, when I talk about these outcomes, they can be any sort of outcome. They don't need to be in dollar terms. But typically, we dollarize them to make them comparable. So if we're talking about storm surges, no storm surge isn't particularly costly, and severe storm surges are very costly. Once we have these outcomes, we can then categorize them by the probabilities with which they will occur, denoted by p's with subscripts, so p sub 1, p sub 2, all the way up to p sub k for k possible outcomes. But what we're going to see in the next lecture is that environmental economics is not particularly well suited for dealing with these uncertain and risky outcomes, these variable outcomes. So before the next lecture on Tuesday, take a minute and think to yourself what might be wrong with this framework. And we'll come back next time and discuss why this framework might be problematic and what we can do about it.